Energy explains so much economically, geopolitically, and socially. And yet almost nobody talks about economics, geopolitics, and sociology with an energy lens. If Trump wins, that's very bearish for oil and gas companies and their equities. It's bullish for production, it's bearish for commodity prices, and bearish for the equities. And if Kamala Harris wins and the Democrats take control of the House in addition to keeping the Senate, that is very bullish for commodity prices and bullish for commodity equities. GMs, Fords, Mercedes, and Audis and Volkswagens of the world are capitalized to compete globally, and they have no chance. They're going to need to be recapitalized.
Battery technology is like a 100-year bond with a 2% coupon that you have to hold to maturity, is what you're basically saying.
I just don't like spending money that I don't have to. My car ride, as long as I have a radio, I don't give a shit what else is in the car. I'll stand in line for that.
Climate change may or may not be real, may or may not be caused by humans, and may or may not be a predecessor to catastrophe, but our limited resources are probably best deployed against reacting to any catastrophes as they arise.
Welcome to Future's Edge. I am Jim Iuorio. That's Bob Iaccino. We have today one of our favorite guests, a friend of the show, Doomberg. He is a green chicken. How are you, my friend?
Jim, Bobby, I could tell by the preamble that this is going to be a fantastic show.
There's no question about it. Sometimes I wish the people who are listening could listen to the bullshit we talk about right before we actually go live, because that's sometimes more of the funny stuff. Okay, I don't know if either of you two know this, but the breaking news, there is an election in about 3 months. Look on your face, I can tell it's a surprise. Both of them have put forth very little on energy policy, but the assumption still stands with most people, including myself, that Trump will be more drill, baby, drill, and Kamala Harris will be not. Can you kind of shed some light on what's at risk in this upcoming election regarding energy policy?
I think you have framed half of it correctly. Those will be the positions of the two candidates should they win. You have to assume that the party that wins the presidency will likely also tip Congress, at least for the first 2 years. And so that's a very precarious 2 years, regardless of which side of the energy debate you might find yourself on. You know, when the House, the Senate, and the president all sit within the same party, you can have pretty lasting legislation, that impacts for decades. We have a bit of a counterintuitive framework for analyzing the political impact on energy in the U.S. in particular. And I should say up front that, we strive not to be political. We have to be aware of politics because politics drives much of energy policy. We would not have chosen either of, any of the three candidates that have been put forward for the presidency thus far. Who knows how many more there will be between now and November. But I digress. If Trump wins, that's very bearish for oil and gas companies and their equities. It's bullish for production, it's bearish for commodity prices, and bearish for the equities. And if Kamala Harris wins and the Democrats take control of the House in addition to keeping the Senate, that is very bullish for commodity prices and bullish for commodity equities, because energy prices are highly inelastic. Very small supply-demand imbalances drive prices to disproportionately higher or low levels. And drill, baby, drill is unabashedly bearish. And drill, baby, drill is something the industry has shown it'll always do when given the opportunity. It has no discipline whatsoever. It will incinerate scores of billions of investor capital to demonstrate growth to Wall Street, even if that growth destroys shareholder value or undercuts the cost of capital of those franchises, which is why we saw a wave of bankruptcies in the shale patch, even though the production numbers in the shale patch have been booming almost in an unrelenting manner for the past 15 years. Even though the vast majority of executives in the oil and gas sector would probably vote for Trump, they will do much better under a Harris administration than a Trump administration, is our view.
So let me talk to you about, or ask you a question rather, about your piece that you just wrote on the 19th. I think it was called Solid State of Affairs.
Mm-hmm.
Subtitle was Breakthrough Batteries Are Just Around the Corner Again. I love this piece, and part of it is because you always point out the absurdity of the overnight conversion to electrification. And you again, in this particular piece, pointed out how the plug-in hybrid electric vehicles would be the solution that the industry is waiting for. I should say the climate change industry would actually be affected by in a positive way. And I wanted to get your view on something, because I think in all the pieces, other than the common sense, the way that you guys write, I can't quite figure out if you guys are affected by the idea of curbing whatever level of human contribution to climate change there is, or if you're kind of just trolling in the background by pointing out the hypocrisy of them pushing electric when hybrid electric would be a much better solution. So can you tell me which is it, and maybe explain just sort of the background of hybrid electric versus electric and the advantages of the former?
Okay, so this is an important point, because we get some crap in the comments all the time. Like, for example, every piece needs to lay waste to the concept of climate change as a real threat to humanity. So I'll just lay out the Doomberg view on climate change, and then how that manifests in the pieces that we write. We would consider ourselves skeptical of the surety of the climate catastrophe crowd. We find most of the science underpinning the claims that the Earth is reaching the abyss to be dubious at best. The climate is a quintessentially nonlinear system in the chaotic sense, in the scientifically chaotic sense, not in the sort of lay definition of chaos. And what does that mean? It means chaotic systems are sensitively dependent on initial conditions, very, very difficult to model, and effectively impossible to control. And so our view is that the world has limited resources. Climate change may or may not be real, may or may not be caused by humans, and may or may not be a predecessor to catastrophe. But our limited resources are probably best deployed against reacting to any catastrophes as they arise, as opposed to preemptively trying to control a classically nonlinear system. Much of our writing necessarily begins with the axiomatic assumption that most governments in the world believe that climate change is real and want to do something about it. And therefore, if we're going to critique climate policies or proposed policies in a way that gets any reasonable audience of influencers to read them, you can't always lead with, this is all nonsense and a waste of time. And you have to say, okay, even if you assume that climate change is real, an axiom that we will allow for the purposes of the following analysis, even in that scenario, it just makes way more sense, for example, that plug-in hybrid electric vehicles are a superior solution to the stated problem, whether or not you believe the stated problem is real, than full battery electric vehicles. And so that is the sort of overarching Doomberg view of the world. And look, we could be wrong, and catastrophes could befall us. But I don't think that we're going to avoid those catastrophes by building windmills and solar panels. I think we're going to have to properly react to them by conserving our gunpowder and deploying it accordingly. We have a piece coming out that you would not have seen yet because we haven't published it on quantifying the cost of adaptation. So there's a whole field of sort of debate around adaptation, and the environmental movement, the climate change crowd, wants none of it. This is like taboo to talk about adaptation. And, let me ask you a question. Like, do you think the drought in the West and the water levels of the Colorado River are the poster child for climate catastrophe? Yes, of course. This has been all over the news for like the past decade. The Colorado River is going to dry up, and there's 40 million people on the back end of this river whose livelihoods are going to be, we're all going to be thirsty and they're going to die of dehydration. Turns out that the government ran a little experiment to basically pay people to use less water from the Colorado River. And in the piece, which I won't give away the sort of the full story, we quantify how much that costs. And surprisingly, it's far cheaper to pay people to use less water than it is to build wind turbines and solar panels and to introduce all of the intermittency into the grid. The piece that you specifically referenced, I'm happy to get into because it wasn't really about climate change. It was about the propensity for those in the scientific community to make exaggerated claims in a certain set of areas. But that's our overarching view on climate change. I hope that was instructive.
My favorite part of that is how you talk about the this sort of consistent N+3 years narrative on these breakthroughs, right? Where there's going to be a battery that's going to give you 932 miles on a charge and charge in 10 minutes, and it should be ready in 3 years. And you hearken back to a story you wrote about the last 3-year prediction that didn't come to fruition. So
let's talk about that. Let me dive into that because I think it's fun.
yeah, it was a lot of fun to read.
So the background is I was an industrial scientist / executive in the sense that I led large teams of scientists, and I'm a trained PhD. And I would routinely get inbound emails from our CEO or other C-suite executives with some story they read in the Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times or Forbes or Reader's Digest back in the day. And they would say, is this real? Tell me what you think about this. And so almost all of those were BS, right? And so we opened this piece. There's a few parts of science that are sort of repeat offenders in this regard. So we opened the piece by talking about the overlap in the Venn diagram of the media's need for clicks, right? The public's interest in science, right? And the desire for life-changing inventions to be real. And in the overlap of sort of those three circles is what we call the science hype cycle. And certain fields of science are uniquely susceptible to such shenanigans. And we talk about the pursuit of room temperature superconductors and the drive to cure cancer. And fusion is in that category, even though we didn't mention it in the piece. And then batteries as an escape valve to our dependence on fossil fuels. Batteries, if you pull up Google and you search battery breakthrough and then you limit the date of the responses to 15 years ago, you will read a dozen stories that sound like they could have been written last week. And having been in the sort of materials sector, the energy materials sector for multiple decades, and having fielded countless inbound inquiries to this effect, I can tell you 2 ironclad, stone cold, lead pipe lock rules about batteries. The first and most important one is there are no breakthrough battery inventions in startups. If you read a story about a battery breakthrough and the company proclaiming that breakthrough is a small startup, it's BS. I have saved more money by not investing or having shareholder money invested in battery startups than anybody has ever made in investing in battery startups. I can assure you of that. The second, almost as important, axiom of the battery sector is there's no such thing as a battery sector S-curve. Battery technology proceeds in an incremental, slightly improved embodiment of the last optimized form factor in very low single-digit % compounding rate over time by the big players in the field. You're never going to wake up and suddenly we see a commercially viable, scalable battery that comes out of nowhere that has twice the energy density, either volumetric or mass, of the existing best-in-class material. If the only thing you take from this discussion is all battery startups are going to fail and all claims of legitimate breakthroughs are premature, you will save yourself an awful lot of time and money.
So battery technology is like a 100-year bond with a 2% coupon that you have to hold to maturity, is what you're basically saying.
And yeah, you better hope that you don't get stuck underwater on a mark-to-market basis and you legitimately have no choice. I've been at this long enough and seen it all. And so whenever we're like short an idea, we can say, well, let's write about batteries because there's going to be a new claim and it's going to be nonsense. And it's going to be blown up by the media, but people love it. Like it just gets clicks. It's hard to explain. Like the batteries is on this short list of technologies.
You mentioned before room temperature conductivity, which turned out to be bullshit a year ago. You mentioned batteries. You mentioned you mentioned hybrids. So is one of the reasons you think hybrid electric is the way to go over full plug-in? The whole model is kind of nonsense in the batteries. And when you have a combustion engine along with it, it's less nonsense? Or does it involve the rare earth materials, the mining, the cobalt, the lithium, all the bullshit?
No. So let's be very clear. We think hybrid technology for cars is a standalone, worthy invention that the market would adopt in the absence of any climate hysteria. Why? In the piece we just wrote that Bobby was referencing,
Yep.
BYD is selling in China today a plug-in hybrid for $14,000 that basically gets you 90 miles per gallon. Now, if I'm a middle-class commuter and I'm going 25 miles each way to work, I'm going to stand in line to buy that car.
Damn straight.
Because it's cheaper to operate and practically free to own. $14,000 for a brand new car, but a well-appointed, Warren Buffett-backed company, stands behind its warranties. That car is going to dominate. And by the way, one of our themes, because we've also written pretty critically about China and how the West is being duped by China in various sectors, the Chinese are going to roll up the automakers. Like the GMs, Fords, Mercedes, and Audis and Volkswagens of the world are capitalized to compete globally, and they have no chance. Like they're going to need to be recapitalized. Like the Global South is going to buy the BYD plug-in hybrid. They're not going to buy the Audi A4. Maybe a few status people will.
Yeah.
But you're telling me that you could get a $14,000 car that goes 2,100 miles on one gas tank and one full charge battery?
Yeah. Yeah. You said the middle-class commuter, even some who have done pretty well, I will take that in a heartbeat. I don't even care what bells and whistles on it. I just don't like spending money that I don't have to. In my car ride, as long as I have a radio, I don't give a shit what else is in the car. I'll stand in line for that.
So there is a drivetrain, a set of drivetrain developments that actually generates customer value that the market would pull as opposed to government push. And the Chinese are dominating that space. Now, the way in which they have come to dominate that space, we have serious questions about, but nonetheless, one of the reasons why we're critical of solid-state batteries is they're super expensive, and they admit as much by saying they were going to be limited to super premium EVs. Well, these are vanity cars of the rich. Like, this is not some climate breakthrough. Who are we kidding? And there's only one parameter that matters. See, once you go to plug-in hybrids and you forget about full battery electric vehicles, you don't actually need to worry about range because you have the engine to back you up. You don't have to actually worry about energy density or battery size because you have the internal combustion engine to propel the vehicle. The only thing that matters is cost per mile driven to the owner of the vehicle. And plug-in hybrids are better than internal combustion engines in this regard. A small battery that gives you a boost that the engine can propel is a legit engineering, customer value accretive breakthrough that the market would be willing to pay for. And the Chinese, and to be totally fair, Toyota have both recognized this for the longest time. And Toyota, if you may recall, was getting enormous crap for not competing against Tesla in BEVs. Toyota is the smartest company in the auto industry. You know, they recognize the threat that China represents. But like no company has done more for the quote unquote environment than Toyota with the Prius. Like very tiny batteries.
Yeah.
Basically doubled the fuel efficiency of the compact car. Latest Priuses look pretty sweet, actually. I have to be totally transparent. Nice looking cars. 50 miles a gallon at the same cost or slightly more expensive than a Corolla or a Honda. Yeah, people are going to line up to buy that car. There's the marginal car buyer is price sensitive, not just upfront price, but operating price as well.
So I'm going to editorialize a little bit before I ask you my question here, which is so strange for me.
Surprise.
Yeah, we have an internal combustion engine automobile in our family here that generates over 630 horsepower, and I have a friend with a Tesla Model S, I believe it's a Plaid, and he keeps trying to goad me into a like 0 to 60 race anywhere I choose. And I told him the other day, I said that's fine as long as we can do a double or nothing race to Chicago from Naples, Florida, and I'm going to take our Toyota Corolla hybrid on that race, which gets right now 52 miles a gallon as gauged by the dash of the Toyota Corolla. And he just kind of like grunts and walks away because it just the sort of obvious nature about what you're saying eludes people. By the way, on the Prius, we ended up with the Corolla because they couldn't keep the Priuses. We went to look by a Prius.
Can't get them.
They couldn't keep it in stock.
Can't get them. Yeah.
And they have a model where they actually combine the small ICE motor with the battery motor, and you can get 0 to 60 for what it means to you guys. It means a lot to me. like near 4 seconds, because both engines kick in when you put it in a certain mode. So it's actually a beautiful, fast little car that still gets somewhere in the range of 50 or 60 miles a gallon. But anyway, I digress. In terms of like the impact of these things, okay, when we talk about, if you're somebody that goes out there and tries to convince people who are sort of on the fence about how fossil fuels, they're just simply going to be here. Do you think there's any value I believe it's three of us. I'm just going to say me and Jimmy just to be sure. Don't believe that government should intervene in much, if anything at all. Do you think there's any value to that sort of discount going to the consumer as opposed to incentives going to the corporations to produce the right vehicles at a fair price? Or should the government, I think we believe the best possible way is to keep the government out of it. But if you had your choice between incentivizing consumers to buy something or incentivizing the industry to do something, which one is more effective in your team's view?
I think neither is effective.
Okay.
And I think integrated across the world, especially since climate change is a quote unquote global challenge, we have this saying that we call Doomberg's postulate, which is that every molecule of fossil fuels produced will be burned by somebody somewhere, and local restrictions against such activities merely change who has the privilege of doing so. What do we mean by this? If you look at the carbon emissions of the globe, and you partition them between the OECD countries and the rest of the world, i.e. the global south, you will see that for the past 20 years, OECD countries, the US, the West, Europe, Japan, South Korea, our emissions have been going down ever so subtly. And the rest of the world's emissions have been skyrocketing. Why? Because they're poor. And poor people want energy because energy is life. Energy defines your standard of living, and every human everywhere wants a higher standard of living. We in the West have the technological prowess to impose a higher standard of living or to extract a higher standard of living per BTU than the emerging economies do. But if we don't burn coal, somebody else is going to burn it, and they're just going to burn it at a cheaper price than it would otherwise be because we're not buying it. And so the gating function of emissions is actually fossil fuel production. And Europe, which is sort of the bellwether of climate evangelicalism, produces no fossil fuels. So what they do is meaningless to the global climate emission equation. And so whether we tell Americans via the consumer that will give you a check to go buy an electric vehicle, or whether we tell Americans via GM and Ford and Chrysler that will pay you a check to build electric vehicles and hope that people show up to buy them, actually is inconsequential to the global carbon emission equation, which is basically all energy sources are additive. So you could build all the wind turbines and solar panels and nuclear power plants that you want. It's not going to stop people from burning coal, natural gas, and oil, because those are really powerful ways to improve one's standard of living. And it would take every country in the world to not burn them and to agree to not burn them and to enforce that they won't burn them, because all it takes is a critical mass of a few, and all of the efforts of the savers get spent somewhere else. And so our view on climate change, to go back to the original sort of discussion that we had, is we're just going to have to roll the dice, because nobody's going to stop. Like, people aren't going to unilaterally disarm and have a lower standard. Look, why do we see the social upheaval that we're seeing in the UK right now, which is another piece that we're working on that we've not yet published, called 1-2 Punch? Well, tentatively called 1-2 Punch. We'll see. Sick immigration. In the popular media, immigration is cast as a racial issue, right? As a hot button issue, or far right objection to immigration. We have a far simpler view. Your standard of living is defined by the amount of energy you personally get to harvest for your family. You put more people into a country and do not increase the net energy production of that country, you're going to reduce the standard of living of everybody. And so, yes, of course, the spark might be immigration and tribalism and the reptilian parts of our brains, but that's all well known, and we understand those things. But in reality, if you got your energy policy right, like, we don't see social upheaval in Norway compared to the UK, and Norway's an energy superpower, and the UK has unilaterally disarmed. And so to us, one last point. Energy explains so much economically, geopolitically, and socially. And yet almost nobody talks about economics, geopolitics, and sociology with an energy lens. And that's where we occupy, the inefficiency in the market of ideas.
So recently I saw an interview, and I don't remember if the interview was with I can't really say his name, Scaringe, I think. He's the CEO of Rivian.
Mm-hmm.
Or it was Peter Rawlinson. I don't remember which one it was. Peter Rawlinson's the CEO of Lucid. One of the two of them said, we now have concrete information that it's now cheaper to drive an EV on a per mile basis than an internal combustion engine. Can you fact check that for me?
I mean, if it were true, they would be spontaneously adopted. I mean, again, the one thing about the market, price triggers action. Right? And so if wind were truly the cheapest source of energy, we wouldn't have to incentivize it. Electricity prices wouldn't be going up everywhere it's introduced. Like this, great. Like, prove it. Let's see the demand. Last I checked, Lucid is losing how much per vehicle they sell at?
A lot.
A lot. They can make those claims. There's one adjudicator of those claims, and it's the market. I believe me, if EVs were measurably cheaper to operate and own than internal combustion engines, we'd be fine with that. Great, give me one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not like we have some ideological opposition to EVs. We have an ideological opposition to the imposition of the need to own EVs, but that's a separate question.
I have a question about power source too, but is this an accurate way to describe, based on what I've heard about the climate crisis, you think that it is most probably bullshit based on the people who are feeding it to us? Doesn't really matter that much because people are going to act on it no matter what. Plus, it's probably not a good idea to pollute the planet regardless if it's bullshit or not. Is that relatively accurate?
Yeah, and I would separate the distinction between pollution and carbon emissions because they're different.
They're certainly different, right? And when
Yeah,
there's not
and-
even all that much proof that carbon emissions are the evil that people say they are, correct?
Well, I mean, again, CO2 is not a pollutant. CO2 could potentially impact the climate.
Yes.
Those are different things.
Good
And
point. Right.
when you look at the litter of plastics in the ocean in Asia, right,
Much bigger deal, seems like.
nobody's for that, right? But one of the things when you partition between climate and pollution is you very quickly begin to realize that certain countries, large ones, play unfairly in this regard.
Of
So
course.
we wrote a piece called Geopolitical Warfare. China is willing to pollute to gain disproportionate market share in key sectors of the economy that they think give them leverage in geopolitics.
Right.
And having competed against the Chinese when they were on the ascent, after they became members of the WTO and all this stuff, all of these sort of B2C companies, the big brands that have their large exhibits at the COP meetings and so on, that love to brag about their sustainability bona fides, I guess is the proper way to say it. They were well aware what the Chinese were doing, stealing Western intellectual property, polluting, taking advantage of, let's call it, forced labor. And when we would highlight these things, when we would be presented with, RFP counter proposals from, requests for proposals, like we want to buy X amount of Y, what's your price? And they would put a Chinese price in front of us that we couldn't meet without losing money or, closing shop. We would point out these quote unquote ESG suboptimalities that the Chinese were partaking in. And they would look at us and say, yeah, that's for the courts to decide. You're going to meet this price or not. In the meantime, you're looking at the CEO of the exact same company bragging about all of their sustainability objectives and their, scope 3 carbon emission reductions for the year and all this nonsense. We like to say that when your competitor's idea of a water treatment facility is a pipeline to the river, it's impossible for a Western company to compete on price. And China did this deliberately. Now, once they have a grip on a supply chain, then they could clean themselves up a little bit, and because the CCP is worried about domestic unrest as a consequence of pollution, and PM 2.5 measurements from the U.S. Embassy are famous for those of us that used to travel to China during the heyday of the China growth story. But this is real. So like the West doesn't make anything anymore because China was willing to debase its environment for a while in order to gain monopoly share, and then they were able to maintain it. And so there's a lot of hypocrisy on the topic, and I think subject of pollution is one that needs to get far more attention than climate, because failing to address the geopolitical activities of our adversaries has led to far more economic destruction than our contortions around carbon. Go ahead.
But you're also, by the way, that's to me. You can talk as long as you want. But the hand signals are to Bobby and I. Nobody wants to hear our bullshit. They want to hear you. But I was going to say, when you lay that out, I think also what you're saying is there is no appropriate solution. We can, unless there's this one world global government that through central bank digital currency and through some sort of oversight can force everybody's hand. But until that day, China can say to us all they want that, no, we're going to make it better. We're going to start today, but it could be all just a bunch of bullshit. So there's really no way to do this.
There's one way to do it, which is that we should decide in the US that we would want to still be in magnesium production, for example, or we should decide in the US that we should still want to be in rare earth processing. And then we should say that we do not want the domestic champions who will participate in these activities and ensure that our military, for example, has a reasonable supply of them. We're not going to penalize them by forcing them to compete against the Chinese. We're going to measure how much it costs for them to operate in an environmentally prudent way and give them money to make up the difference. Like, it's okay for public-private partnerships. Well, what are the failures of the fully private market? One of the failures of the fully private market is it does tend to fail to properly account for the degradation of the environment, which is a public good. That's just true. Like, the pure capitalists who are listening might object to that, but that's just undeniable.
We're pure capitalists. I agree with that 100%.
But a second thing that the truly private market fails to properly price is national security. And we have allowed Wall Street to hollow out the manufacturing sector in the US in the name of efficiency, which has led to all of the world's manufacturing basically going to Asia. Not all, but I'm speaking, to make a point. And suddenly we wake up, if we wanted to go to war with China tomorrow, which I think is a terrible idea, most of the supply chains that feed our military have choke points in China, right? Like, this is true. This is real. One of the reasons why we're losing the war in Ukraine is because China is on Russia's side, not on the Ukrainian side, not on the US side. If that were different, the war would be different. We should have known that going in. Amongst the other things we should have known, like sanctions wouldn't work. But we should take from what has transpired in the past 5 years a very important lesson. There are certain industries, by the way, full credit to the administration, they're trying right now to get the AI genie back in the bottle and trying to keep the Chinese out of it preemptively. It's not going to work. It's too late. But at least they're trying. But we should, for example, China owns 97% of the first three steps of the solar supply chain, which is the production of solar grade polysilicon, the conversion of that solar grade polysilicon into ignits, and then the slicing of those ignits into wafers. Even if you produce polysilicon in the US, it's going to be shipped to China for processing because we have no such processing here. It's the same story in rare earth metals. You could open up a rare earth metal mine in Utah or somewhere in the West. All of the processing, which is the dirty part of the supply chain, is done in China, 100%. So, like, you can mine all the concentrate of the rare earths that go into magnets that are needed for wind turbines and electric motors all you want, but it's getting on a boat and going to China for processing. And if they decide not to send that boat back, you're not getting your magnets, right? Wow. They do this strategically. You can see it if you have sort of a technical background as we do and have participated in industry as we have. It's very easy to see. By the way, I don't blame them. They are playing the pieces on the board as they see them.
Yeah. But you've outlined, here's what we should do, here's what we should do. But we all agree, the three of us, is that the government doesn't often do what it should do. And when they do, it's oftentimes too late. What are real steps that just logical thinkers like you, like, who are you lobbying? Is this just going to, are we beating our head against the wall, I guess is my question.
No. So look, we don't have to accept that as an outcome.
Okay.
I agree with you that is the is state. But if you take a guy that we've chronicled a few times, Joe Manchin, like, Joe Manchin gets it. Joe Manchin understands energy. Joe Manchin is a Democrat in name only, who comes from a deeply red state, who, even though he ran as a Democrat won the governorship, and when he was a governor, was elected the head of the National Association of Governors, and then straight into the Senate as a Democrat. And all Joe Manchin has ever done as a senator is think about how to create the most amount of energy for Americans with an all-of-the-above approach. And that's just, we need more Joe Manchins. So like many of our readers and our subscribers would probably lean Republican and might be perturbed at us praising a Democrat turned independent. We're not partisans, we're ideologues. And on energy, Joe Manchin is among the best of this generation. He gets it. He understands it. He was in the sector, by the way. Like critics will say, oh, he used to run a coal brokerage. Yeah, no S. Like, okay, he knows the business and he comes from a coal state. Of course he's going to represent those interests. Yeah. Like, it's okay for some of our politicians to have relevant industrial experience and some financial stake in the matter. That's how it always works. And so we don't have to accept mediocrity. We don't have to accept the slate of presidential candidates we have today. We can do better. We will do better. We have to do better. I refuse to believe that the best days of North America, because I would include Canada in this mix, and Lord knows we could talk all day about Justin Trudeau. NAFTA, Canada, Mexico, US, Western Hemisphere, Monroe Doctrine, we have an enormous amount of resources. We have oil, we have gas, we have coal, we have fertilizer, we have soil, we have deep water ports, we have great institutions, we have the world's best universities, we have there's no reason for us to be swirling the toilet. Like, let's get our act together. It's on us. It's not about the Chinese. It's not what the Chinese are doing to us. It's what we have allowed the Chinese to do to us. Ultimately, we're hopeful. We try to point out these things so that people can see them through the lens that we see them through. That seems to resonate with our subscribers, and we've been able to carve out a nice life doing this. But there's no reason to accept the mediocrity that we're currently swimming in our view.
You mentioned the criticisms of Joe Manchin for being from the industry. There's a strange, what I believe to be a very small sector of the population that's interested in politics that criticize people for actually having been in the private sector. Do you guys know who Charlemagne the God is? He's a host of a very, very popular urban radio show, and he has political guests on all the time. He's a Democrat. He said he's supporting Kamala Harris. Don't care about that. But he had Vivek Ramaswamy on when he was still a candidate, and his co-host, who I apologize, but her name escapes me, was absolutely eviscerating Vivek because he had spent his early years in the private sector trying to enrich himself as opposed to spending time in public service. And then he was running for president. And he seemed to me, as a biotech CEO, to be somebody who, in this particular moment, might be tremendously qualified to look into the COVID situation and everything else. But whatever. I mean, it just, according to the way that I interpreted the conversation, which could be wrong, she was saying you should have been a community organizer and then a local politician and then run for president, rather than having been involved in an industry that's sort of critical to our equities and to our overall development in technology. But having said that, I asked you to fact check something that the left side of the CEO spectrum says. Now I want to ask you to fact check something that Vivek actually said in a return interview to that same show, Charlemagne the God show. I was watching that interview, and he said that more people die from cold than hot. In other words, if you start trying to limit fossil fuels, you'll get a lot more death, at least from what we know now, than you would from trying to convert fossil fuels and eliminate them into simply, quote unquote, renewables that don't include natural gas. Is there a fact check you can do on what Vivek said in that case?
So it is objectively true that more people die from exposure to the cold elements than do from excess heat.
He actually said climate change disasters. He didn't say heat, so I want to make sure I correct that.
Well, I would say both are important. The core argument, climate change crowd, is that the warming of the earth is deeply net negative to humans. And there is a pretty compelling body of scientific data that would nullify that hypothesis. That's probably what he was referring to. Anybody who has been lost in the woods in the winter would much rather be lost in the woods in the summer, even during a heat wave.
Yes.
It's just objectively true that we wrote a piece, New England is an energy crisis waiting to happen. And we opened that piece some 2.5 years ago with the whole concept of thermal comfort. And humans have a relatively narrow band of temperature, which is known in the scientific community as thermal comfort. You feel, as the name would imply, you're not too cold and you're not too warm. And the center point of that band is, as you might imagine, what we have come to know as room temperature. There's a reason why you can sit here, Bobby, during this interview in a golf shirt, because the room that you're sitting in has been optimized for your thermal comfort. The mid 70s is a lot closer to 90 or 100 degrees than it is to zero. And the physics of having to impose the order on your local environment, which is the human endeavor, which is your standard of living, the physics of bringing up a temperature from freezing to bringing down a temperature from 95 to room temperature dictates that far less energy is required for the latter. And so if we're going to have slightly warmer temperatures, it's an easier task to condition the air around you to slightly cool it than it is to, if we had a mini ice age and we couldn't grow crops and the sun was, blotted out, that would be a far more dangerous catastrophe than a few degrees of warming, which is why the climate crowd has to spin these narratives about, ocean cycles, and rising waters, and all this other stuff. Because, by the way, high temperatures and high CO2 are conducive to plant growth. Plant growth is the food that feeds all of animal life, including human life. Photosynthesis is the engine of life, and it gets better at higher temperatures and elevated CO2 levels. And so that's a pretty difficult thing to counter. And so to counter it, you have to conceive of a parade of calamities that will befall us. The isolated argument that higher temperatures are bad for humans is just easily nullified.
Okay. So I know that we have about time for one. I hate when you're on sometimes because it seems like we've been on for 10 minutes and we've been on for almost 55. And I appreciate that, but it goes so quickly. So here's my last question to you. The last time we spoke to you, we spoke about nuclear being more of the answer than just about anything else. Have we seen any global traction to pursue that thesis so far? And do you still agree with it?
I mean, theoretically, if you're, again, back to the axiom of analysis of we must decarbonize, then there's no way to do it without nuclear. Absent mass suffering, which was the point I believe I made last time. The one country that is leading the charge in this regard is China.
Right.
China is building out nuclear power in an all-of-the-above strategy because they recognize it. And by the way, it's not cheap. It's not expensive in China like it is here. Gee, why is that? Because we choose to make it expensive with onerous regulations and lawsuits and environmental opposition and so on. None of that happens in China. And so China is about to, in the next probably 5 years, will lap the U.S. The U.S. today is the leading producer of nuclear energy in the world. We also are the leading producer of oil in the world, 20% of world supply. We're the leading producer of natural gas in the world, 26% of world supply. We're a net exporter of coal. We're top 5 hydroelectricity producer. The U.S. is an energy gigapower. Back to the whole, we don't have to accept the politics of today. The U.S. has a great future. Canada could be a great superpower or a greater superpower than it already is. We wrote about that recently. China is leading the race in nuclear. And once all these plants are built, they're never going to be turned off. These are 80-year annuities of standards of living, basically. A country that gets this right, another one is the UAE. Even though they're rich in oil and gas, they're building out nuclear as fast as they can.
But I guess my question was, the independent of the climate crap, it seems to me like nuclear is a pretty good energy solution anyway, right?
So look, there's a reason why the shipping industry, subs, aircraft carriers went from wood to coal to diesel to nuclear. Right? Like energy density is the single most important parameter in the hands of a good engineer. In other words, show me the engineer that has the highest energy dense form of fuel, and I'll show you the society that is crafted around that fuel that is the richest. And we have proactively chosen, for a variety of interesting reasons, to limit our indulgence of the true potential of nuclear energy. It's a great tragedy of the past 50 years. Dwight Eisenhower was a brilliant futurist in this regard. He left us with the civilian nuclear energy sector and the national highway system. I mean, talk about it 1-2, and warned us about the military-industrial complex on the way out the door. I mean, and he won a world war for us. I mean, find me a greater America?
Yeah, he's underrated, isn't he? I mean,
highly underrated. I mean, give me a break. So yeah, like we could do better. But the whole point, like we wrote a piece on all of this called "Be Like Ike." Like, let's find the Ike that is going to bring us back to a path of sanity. Nuclear power is far and away the safest. By the way, here's the thing that I love. Like, people get all worked up about nuclear waste and meltdown risk and all this nonsense. So first of all, there's no such thing as nuclear waste. Spent fuel from today's reactors can easily be run through breeder reactors and recycled for future generations of fuel. We use something like 4% of the embodied energy in a nuclear fuel rod today, and we just call the other 96% sitting there waiting to be used waste. I mean, what a failure of public affairs on the part of the nuclear sector. And then we talk about the risk of nuclear. There's no such thing as a trade-off free world, of course, right? So, like, let's take hydroelectricity, green, right, renewable. There was a dam collapse in China that is rumored to have killed 250,000 people in the 70s. Okay. Yeah. The St. James, the James Bay hydroelectricity project in Quebec killed countless caribou and displaced indigenous people from their historical lands, and tens of thousands of acres of, nature disrupted, destroyed, flooded. Hydroelectricity. Can you imagine a nuclear accident that killed 250,000 people?
No.
And by the way, we have millions of people, I'm going to say it quietly, living in the flood zone of potential dam collapses in the U.S. And here's a little scandal for you. We have underinvested in the maintenance of those dams.
Of course we have.
Right? So the nuclear industry, which is built to withstand an airplane crashing into a reactor and hurricanes and tornadoes. Here's a fascinating stat.
It's crazy.
You cannot find a single human being on planet Earth who has ever been injured by nuclear waste. The number is 0. I can show you a video of 2 tragic young men on top of a wind turbine that caught on fire, and they couldn't escape. Right? The number of deaths from wind turbine fires exceeds the number of injuries for nuclear waste.
Yeah.
But the boogeyman of nuclear power is such that, like, with nuclear, we like to say 0 is an emotional number. Right? Like yes, Chernobyl happened. Like, yes, Fukushima happened. There's been officially 1 death tied to Fukushima, which was a cancer patient a couple of years later.
Yeah.
The 250,000 people who died in the dam collapse in China don't count. Right? Hydroelectricity is green.
And it's
renewable.
just amazing that when you say it, like, it just smacks so hard. Like, it is absolute insanity. We continue doing that. Bob, do you have anything else? Should we play us out?
I'm good.
Thank you so much for being here. Doomberg, where can they find you?
You can find everything at Doomberg.com. We have successfully ejected a squatter from that domain name, and now we own it.
Nice.
And, so
I was the squatter, just so you know.
Yes, I can tell you bought a nice plug-in hybrid with the proceeds.
I did indeed.
But yeah, Doomberg.com. You'll find all of our articles, our podcast appearances like this one, our pro tier, and everything to do with Doomberg there. I really appreciate it, Jim and Bobby. Always a blast. I look forward to every invite that comes in the inbox, and looking forward to the next one too.
This has been The Future's Edge. I am Jim Iuorio. That's Bob Iaccino. That's Doomberg. If you don't now subscribe to his Substack, you are missing out, because they write brilliantly. They are fantastic. Thank you guys. None of this works without you guys, without all the retweets, the DMs, the recommendations to your friends. We appreciate it. Remember what Bobby and I are trying to do here. We spent 20 years each in mainstream media, and we hate saying mainstream media, but there we had the pressures of producers, the pressures of sponsors, not to give our message, but to give their message. Our opinions might be bullshit, but they're at least our opinions, and they're not weighed upon by those two entities. So thank you guys very much for joining us in the Features Edge.